And Major Garrett joins me now along with David Weigel and Brooke Staggs. Dave is a political reporter for the Washington Post. Brooke is a political reporter with the Orange County Register and CBS News senior White House and political correspondent Ed O'Keefe is helping me lead this discussion. Ed will be co-anchoring our coverage of the recall tonight. Welcome to all of you. Major, there's more than 22 million eligible voters in California. How big of a turnout are election officials expecting, and how might it compare to other recent elections?
Probably 10 million, a little bit more than that, maybe 12 million. It would be close to the 2020 election turnout, maybe a little bit lower than that, which would be surprisingly high for a unicorn-type election, which recall elections typically are. This one is not occurring in November, the typical cycle for an election, but mid-September. That's very unusual for California. And Democrats believe, looking at the data so far, that because of a large embedded registration advantage, Democrat to Republican here, they're doing fairly well. One potentially worrisome sign is returns so far indicate that Latino turnout is trailing 2020 turnout by a considerable margin. That might be an area of vulnerability for Governor Newsom, but his team overall expects to win and win somewhat handily. I can tell you, Elaine, talking to Republicans up and down the state with various campaigns and close to this election, their internal tracking polling has Newsom winning on the recall question by a margin of either 8 to 16 points. It runs in that spectrum. So high single digits, low double digits, or mid double digits, so they don't believe they are well positioned to knock Newsom out of the governor's mansion.
Dave Weigel, it's not an election night unless I get to talk to you for a little bit, so I'm glad you're here. And folks, if you don't read his campaign newsletter, The Trailer, you're missing out. There you go, Dave. How's that for a shameless plug? Look, more than 9 million people.
Thank you. I'll mail the check.
Yes, thank you. More than 9 million people voted early in California, most of them, as Major said, Democrats. Are we seeing another election day push from Republicans like we did in the 2020 election, or are California Republicans behaving differently?
Almost exactly like you saw in 2020, perhaps a bit more intense. And you saw the same thing in Georgia's runoffs in January. You saw the same thing there, too, with former President Trump saying that the election looks like it's going to be rigged, which has not been great for turnout. You're not seeing people who were about to vote yes on the recall staying home for that reason. But what Major was talking about is the general mood. While Larry Elder's talking about how he would win, he says he believes that there is going to be a vote to overwhelm that early vote so far, that most Democrats cast their ballots early, that recall voters are turning out today. And if you're at the polls, that's being reflected. Republican voters who do not trust the mail are showing up in person and voting. But that confidence from Democrats is they built an enormous turnout effort, the kind they don't normally need to win a statewide election in California. They can tell you how many people they've contacted. They're confident that the Democrats who returned those ballots voted for Newsom, voted against the recall. Polling, too, Republicans were saying maybe a few weeks ago, perhaps if this is successful, maybe 30% of registered Democrats might vote for the recall. Polling, as Democrats became more engaged, showed Democratic support, Biden voter support for the recall in single digits. So something needs to happen to surprise us and overwhelm this 2-to-1 Democratic advantage. Remember, non-party voters in California, too, the independents, have broken for Democrats in the last few years. So that Republicans don't look at the independent vote right now, a vote that was for the 2003 recall, and see necessarily enough votes to beat the Democrats.
Okay, so Brooke, Dave touched on my question there. There are more than 6.5 million independent or unaffiliated voters in California. How big a role might they play in this election?
Well, the latest polling shows about 64% of them have said that they are not in favor of the recall. And so clearly that's not, the margin that Republicans wanted to see to be able to, break off a significant chunk of those folks. Even in a place like Orange County, where I'm based, which has traditionally been more Republican, Democrats have a slight overall edge there now. But even there, all of our recent polls shows that the independent voters are pretty evenly split, maybe very narrowly favoring a recall, but definitely not the margins that Republicans need in order to make up the gap in terms of GOP-Dem voter registration in the state.
Dave, Larry Elder is the frontrunner among Republicans looking to replace Newsom. What is it about him and his platform that's appealing to voters? And are there any other Republicans tonight that we perhaps haven't paid as much attention to who could gain a substantial number of votes?
Well, Elder burst into the race at almost the last minute. He filed his paperwork so late that he went to court to challenge a rule about releasing your tax returns with your paperwork. And he got in months after Kevin Faulconer. You saw Kevin Colley in that clip. A bunch of Republicans with a more work inside the party, more elected experience, i.e. any elected experience, were already running. He blew them away. Elder, who might not be that familiar to a lot of Democrats, a lot of liberals, has been a fixture in Southern California, conservative movement politics for better part of 30 years. He hosted a drive time show in LA in the 90s. He hosts a show on Salem Network now. He's continued to appear on conservative media and give some fairly right-wing positions that he doesn't necessarily emphasize when he's talking to maybe editorial boards or trying to convince a Democrat to vote for him. He is not as bombastic as someone like Donald Trump. He likes to use data and anecdotes and kind of explain his position as common sense. But he's very conservative. He's emphasized that he'd get rid of all the vaccine and mask mandates on day one, he says, before he had his first cup of tea. But he also, he opposes the idea of a minimum wage. He says Roe versus Wade was incorrectly decided. He's called for privatizing Social Security. He's a very down the line kind of libertarian Republican of the sort that California has really not elected in its modern history. And the period where California is the kind of state that votes for Joe Biden by 29 points, that is not how candidates run to win. But the recall rules explained at the top mean he's just been waiting and hoping to see if 50% of voters say, yes, I want to recall Gavin Newsom. It doesn't matter if Democrats don't like him. If he'll be the most popular candidate on the second part of the ballot. And that's kind of unquestioned. I mean, Republicans who are not Larry Elder have struggled for attention. The fact that Newsom keeps going back at him to win votes, attacking Elder, has helped Elder's campaign. They've built each other up in a way that if the recall went the wrong way, Newsom would obviously regret.
Well, Major, President Biden campaigned for Governor Newsom Monday night in Long Beach. Let's listen to part of what he had to say about this recall and Larry Elder.
The eyes of the nation, this is not hyperbole, the eyes of the nation are on California. Because the decision you're about to make isn't just going to have a huge impact on California. It's going to reverberate around the nation. And quite frankly, not a joke. The leading Republican running for governor is the closest thing to a Trump clone that I've ever seen.
So, Major, why has this recall garnered so much national attention, and could the outcome have implications heading into the 2022 midterm elections?
Well, a couple of very simple reasons, Elaine and Ed, is because for a while, about 5 or 6 weeks ago, this thing looked up for grabs. The public polling, which Democrats believed, as you have to believe when bad polling numbers come in, had this race between 3, 5, 6 points. Almost astonishing turn of events in a state as blue as California, with such a repetitive history of electing Democrats to statewide office. Republican hasn't won statewide in California since 2006. It's been a long drought for Republicans, and suddenly Gavin Newsom, who, as Dave pointed out, won this handily in 2018, looked vulnerable. So then Gavin Newsom, once a rising party star, had to start calling in a lot of Democrats to help him out, to create what was non-existent at that time 5 or 6 weeks ago, which was Democratic Party enthusiasm. So Elizabeth Warren came, Bernie Sanders came, Amy Klobuchar came, Kamala Harris came, and the big ringer of all, President Biden, all of which, and former President Obama cut an ad, all of which to send a signal to partisan Democrats here, hey, this is a serious, serious deal. Your governor is in trouble. And it's not as if Gavin Newsom is beloved, but Democrats have rallied behind him and looked at this as a Trump-influenced recall effort. And Larry Elder has helped make that message all the more resonant, certainly among Democrats, quite possibly among independent voters as well. But I want to stress something that I think I'd like everyone else to at least chew on for a second. I think there could be two winners from this recall. Governor Newsom could defeat the recall effort and remain governor. But Larry Elder, I do believe, has been springboarded into California and possibly national politics by this late entry, raising $10 million and skyrocketing to the top of the Republican field here in California. I talked to him on Sunday at his beautiful home in the Hollywood Hills, not exactly the epicenter of a populist revolt, let us say. And he told me, I think my life has changed. I think I'm going to stay in this work. I think I'm going to stay in politics, not as a talk show host or as an observer or someone in the peanut gallery, but someone in the arena. If that's true, Larry Elder could emerge from this recall defeated, but not necessarily done for.
You don't think there are any populists in the Hollywood Hills, Major, huh?
I said not exactly, Ed, not exactly.
Yeah, that's fair enough. Well, Brooke, let's chew on this a little bit in this regard. Both elder and former President Trump have said there will be fraud in this election and that it's rigged. Is that something California voters are concerned about? And how does that potentially factor into his future if he runs around saying there was fraud and there may or may not be examples of that?
There's definitely a lot of chatter about that in California right now. I mean, I can tell you my inbox, my social media feeds are being flooded with folks that are raising concerns about things that they've seen, that they've heard. Most of the time it's those kind of third hand, a friend of a friend heard this, saw this, that kind of thing. And it's sometimes hard to separate those folks who, really believe that there's some serious fraud going on, the folks that are, trying to further that narrative, obviously for political reasons. But I can tell you, I've definitely had conversations with regular voters who are sometimes quick to say, I'm not one of those people, that distrust the campaigns in general. But I think because this has become such a prominent topic and it's in the media like this so much, it's kind of put that idea out there. And even some of those folks that maybe hadn't worried about some of these things before are calling and asking me questions about things that they've seen. And, the vast majority of the time when those folks call, we can kind of walk them through and explain some of the checks and balances that are in place, to make sure that ballots haven't been tampered with, to, allow for observation, to check signatures, all of these things that are in place. And most of the time, those folks that are, maybe weren't traditionally questioning this are able to kind of calm down and say that they start to feel more confident, in the process. And then there's certainly a segment of folks that, I don't think there's anything you could say, to convince them that the election is secure. And so I think that definitely, does raise concerns. That whole spectrum raises concerns for folks about, faith in the entire system and what's going to happen after the election, what that means for, for somebody like Larry Elder. But I do think, certainly even yesterday, recall proponents that I was talking to that pushed this whole thing from the beginning said that, Larry Elder getting into the race was something that they think, certainly helped Newsom. And so by him putting out those types of claims about election fraud certainly, stirs up a segment of the base that either believes that or wants to believe that. But I think some of the more moderate, folks, which would tie into, again, like the independent folks, they're not happy with that narrative that's out there.
Yeah, the Gavin Newsom versus Larry Elder storyline seems very much to be continued at this point. All right, Major Garrett, Dave Weigel, and Brooke Staggs, thank you all very much.